The farmer's elevator at Rideau Junction burned on the 19th of October, 1896, and it took 4 hours and 10 minutes to burn. And for the first 35 minutes of that, there were 11 men on the ground who could have saved it. And every one of them did the thing that killed it. And the only man who knew better was standing 40 feet away with his hat in his hand, not saying anything, because he had said it 4 times already that year and had been told twice to mind his own business. His name was Gideon Ryle, and he was the night watchman, which in that town meant he was nobody. I am going to tell this properly, because it has been told wrong for 50 years in that county, and I have the reason to care that my father was one of the 11 men. To understand what happened, you have to understand what a grain elevator actually is, and almost nobody does, including a great many of the men who worked in them. An elevator is not a barn. It is not a warehouse. It is a machine for lifting grain, and everything about its shape follows from that one purpose. Grain comes in at the bottom, at ground level, off a wagon. It has to get to the top, because from the top it can be sent down by gravity into whatever bin you want, and gravity is free, and men are not. So the whole building is built around the lifting. In the middle of it there is a leg, which is a tall, closed wooden shaft running from a pit in the basement all the way to the head house at the very top, 60 or 80 feet up. And inside that shaft, an endless belt runs with iron cups bolted to it, dipping into the grain at the bottom and carrying it to the top and dumping it. That is the elevator. That is what the word means. Everything else in the building is bins and spouts hung around that one shaft. And here is the fact that killed the Rideau Junction elevator and killed a good many others across this country in those decades, and that not one man in 100 understood. A grain elevator is a chimney. It is a tall building full of vertical wooden shafts that run from the basement to the roof and are closed on all sides. And a closed vertical shaft with an opening at the bottom and an opening at the top is precisely and exactly a chimney, and it will behave like one. Heat rises in it. Air is drawn in at the bottom to replace what rises. And if there is fire anywhere near the bottom of that shaft, the shaft will pull it up the whole height of the building in a matter of minutes, faster than a man can climb stairs, and deliver it into a head house full of dust at the very top. The elevator does not burn from the bottom up the way a house does. It burns from the bottom to the top almost at once, through the legs, and then the top burns down onto everything else. Gideon Ryle knew that. He was 58 years old, and he had been a night watchman for 6 years, and before that he had spent 11 years working in elevators in 2 states, and before that, and this is the part of it that nobody in Rideau Junction knew because he did not tell people, he had been inside one when it went. That was in Illinois in 1882, and I will come back to it, because it is the reason for everything he did afterward, and because of what it cost him. Now, the farmer's elevator at Rideau Junction was built in 1891 by a cooperative of about 40 farmers who had got tired of the prices the line elevator was paying them, and it was the best thing that had happened to that township in 20 years, and by 1896 there was somewhere near 90,000 bushels of the district's wheat in it on any given day in the autumn. That is what was at stake. Not a building. 90,000 bushels belonging to about 40 families, which was their entire year, in one wooden box. Gideon Ryle was hired to watch it at night at $11 a month, because a cooperative that could not afford much else could afford a watchman, and because he had asked for the job specifically. He walked that building from 6 in the evening until 6 in the morning, and he had a lantern and a route and a set of habits, and it is those habits that this story is about. He carried a pocket full of chalk. That was the thing everyone in Rideau Junction knew about Gideon Ryle, and that everyone thought was a peculiarity of an old man with too much time on his hands at night. He marked things. He would find a bearing running warm, or a leaking spout, or a pile of sweepings against a wall, and he would chalk a circle around it, or a cross on it, and write the date next to it. And then he would tell the manager in the morning, and if it was not fixed, he would chalk it again the next night with the new date beside the old one. By the autumn of 1896, there were places in that building with 6 and 8 dates chalked next to each other in a column. The manager was a man named Pallister, and he was not a fool, and he was not lazy. He was a farmer, elected by the other farmers to run the elevator, with no training in elevators whatsoever, which is how a cooperative works. And what Pallister thought about Gideon Ryle, and said out loud to other men more than once, was that the old watchman was a worrier who wanted to feel important, and that if you did everything on Ryle's list, you would never run a bushel through the place. There is one more thing he did, and it is not the chalk, and it is the thing that mattered on the night, and nobody noticed him doing it for 6 years. Every night on his last round before dawn, Gideon Ryle closed things. He went through that elevator, and he shut the manhole covers on the leg casings, and he closed the slide gates at the bottoms of the spouts, and he shut the doors on the headhouse stairs, and he closed every hatch and hood he could reach. And then in the morning, the daymen came in and opened all of it again, because you cannot run an elevator with the legs shut, and nobody ever thought about it. And if anybody had asked him, he would have said that a building sleeps better closed up, which is the kind of thing an old watchman says and gets no further questions. He was not being tidy. He was sealing the chimney. The Illinois elevator was called the Cranmer, and it burned on a February night in 1882, and Gideon Ryle was 44 years old and was the head man on the night shift, which is to say, he was in charge. There were 5 of them working. They were cleaning bins, which is winter work, and there was a lamp hung in the basement near the boot of the north leg, which is the pit at the bottom where the cups dip into the grain, and one of the men knocked it. It was not a large fire. That is the whole of what Gideon Ryle carried for the rest of his life. When he first saw it, it was a fire about the size of a hearth fire in a corner of a basement, and there were 5 men standing around it with buckets and a barrel of water 8 feet away. And what he said, because he was in charge, and because it was February, and because there was smoke, was, "Get the doors." He meant open them for the smoke. Everybody meant that in 1882. It is the most natural instinct a human being has in a burning building, and it is very nearly always right. And in a grain elevator, it is the exact wrong thing. And he did not know that yet, and there was no one alive in that county who could have told him. 2 men went up and opened the head house doors of the top, 65 feet above, to let the smoke out. He said afterward that the change was like a door being opened on a locomotive. The fire in the corner of that basement, which had been a fire you could have walked around, drew flat sideways along the floor toward the boot of the leg and went up into the leg casing and was in the head house at the top of the building in less than a minute and a half. They got 3 men out. 2 did not come out. One was a boy of 19 named Cassidy, whom Gideon Ryle had hired himself 6 weeks before. The inquiry in Illinois found no fault with anybody. It found that a lamp had been overturned and that the fire had spread with unusual rapidity, and it used that phrase, unusual rapidity, and it went into the record, and nothing further was learned from it by anybody. Gideon Ryle spent the next 2 years finding out why. That is the part I find remarkable, and it is not a sympathetic story of a man broken by guilt, though he was that too. He went and found out. He wrote to insurance men who knew more about fires than anybody because they paid for them. He talked to millwrights and elevator builders. He went and looked at 2 other burned elevators, one in Iowa, and stood in the wreck of them and asked questions of anybody who would answer. And in about 2 years he assembled in his head, with no schooling and no vocabulary for it, an entirely correct understanding of why elevators burn the way they do, which was that the legs are flues, that the fire is drawn upward by the draft in them, that the draft is created by the difference between the openings at the bottom and the openings of the top, and that therefore the single most important thing a man can do when a fire starts in an elevator is to close it, everywhere, immediately, and above all, not to open anything above the fire. Close it and it smolders and you can fight it. Open it and it is a furnace with a stack. He also worked out the second half of it, which is the part that no one wanted to hear, and which he stopped saying out loud after about 1890, and which is this. Once a leg has drawn fire the length of the building, the elevator is gone.
You do not save it. There is no water pressure in a country town that reaches 80 feet, and the fire is above you, and it is in a wooden shaft you cannot get into, and everything you do after that point is theater. The whole of it, then, is in the first 3 or 4 minutes, before the fire finds the leg. He never worked days again after Illinois. He took night watchman positions, which are the lowest and worst paid jobs in the trade and are given to old men, and he took them at 46 when he was in the prime of his working life and could have been a manager. My father asked him about that once, years later, and he said only that a watchman is there in the first 3 minutes. He had put himself, deliberately, and at the cost of his whole career, in the one job that exists in an elevator during the only period of time in which an elevator fire can be stopped. And then he spent 14 years being the fussy old man who chalks dates on the walls. He tried 4 times in 1896, and I have the dates because Pallister wrote them down afterward, when it mattered to him very much to be able to show that he had listened. Before I give those 4, I want to describe what 6 years of that man's nights actually consisted of, because the 4 attempts are the visible part, and the nights are the substance, and my father walked with him twice and told me about it in detail. The shift was 12 hours, 6 to 6, and the building was empty, and it was completely dark except for what he carried. He walked a route, and the route did not vary. Basement first, always. Both leg boots, hand on each bearing housing, not looking at it, hand on it, because a bearing tells you with heat long before it tells you with smoke or noise. Then the pit and the corners of the basement where the sweepings collect. Then up. He went up the outside stairs and not the inside ones, in all weather, in January, at 58 years old. And my father asked him why once, and he said that a man who uses the inside stairs at night gets used to the inside stairs, and that if he ever needed to know whether the outside stairs were sound, he wanted to have been on them the night before. Then the bins floor, and the belt floor, and the head house at the top, where he would open the shutter and look at the town for a minute, which was the only thing he did on that round that was not work. And then, coming down, he closed the building. Every hatch, every manhole cover, the slide gates, the head house doors. That was the last thing on the last round at about 4:30 in the morning. And then he sat in the scale house with a lamp until 6. $11 a month, 12 hours a night, 6 nights a week, for 6 years. And in all that time,
the building never once burned while he was in it. And it is the nature of the work that this proves nothing to anybody. He did other things too, small ones, and I list them because they are the sort of thing that does not go in a report. He knew every man on the day crew by name, and he knew which of them smoked and where they went to do it. And he never reported any of them, and he swept those places himself. He kept a bucket of sand at the bottom of each leg, which was his own idea and which he paid for out of his own money when Pallister would not, because sand is better than water on a bearing fire, and he knew it. He had worked out and written on the scale house wall, in chalk, a list in order of what a man should do if he found fire, and it was 5 lines long, and the daymen used to write jokes under it. And once a month, on his own time, on a Sunday, he walked the building with the chalk and made a new list of everything that wanted doing, and left it on Pallister's desk, and there were 61 of those lists by the autumn of 1896, and Pallister kept them all, and my father saw them in 1904 in a box in Pallister's house, and Pallister was not able to talk about them. The first turn was in March, and it was about the boot of the south leg, and it was the closest Gideon Ryle ever came to being taken seriously. He had chalked a bearing on that boot 11 times since December. A bearing runs in a hard place down there, in the pit, in the dust, and when it goes dry, it runs hot, and a hot bearing in a grain pit is the commonest cause of elevator fire there is. He told Pallister the bearing wanted replacing and not greasing. And Pallister did something better than nothing and worse than enough. He had it greased, thoroughly, and he had a man check it weekly, and he told Ryle it would be replaced in the summer when the elevator was empty and they could shut the leg down. Which was entirely reasonable. You cannot pull a leg boot apart in March with the building full. It was not replaced in the summer.
There was a reason, and the reason was good, which was that the cooperative spent that money on a new dump grate after a wagon went through the old one in May and nearly took a team down with it, and a man could argue that they were right to. The second turn was in July, and this is the one that ruined him. He asked Pallister, in front of 3 other men in the office, for a written rule about fire, and what he wanted in it was one line, that if fire were found, nobody was to open a door, hatch, or window above the fire, and the legs were to be shut. And one of the men in that office, a farmer on the board named Tolman, laughed. He did not laugh cruelly. He laughed because it sounded, said out loud with no explanation attached, like the most obviously wrong thing a person could say. You are in a burning building, and this old fellow wants a rule that you must not open the windows. Gideon Ryle tried to explain it. And here is where he was defeated by his own history, because the explanation requires the Cranmer, requires saying, I was in charge of a building where this happened, and 2 men died, and one of them was 19, and I told them to open the doors myself, and he could not say it. I want to be exact about why he could not, because it is not simple shame. He had never told anybody in Rideau Junction about Illinois. He had come there at 52 and taken a watchman's job and let people think he was an old man who had always been an old man. And the thing he was afraid of, and he said this to my father in 1901, and my father told me, was not that they would blame him for the Cranmer. It was that once they knew, everything he ever said about fire would be understood as the Cranmer talking. He would not be a man with knowledge, he would be a man with a wound, and men are kind to wounds and do not act on them. So he stood in that office in July of 1896 with the entire proof of his position in his mouth and did not say it, and asked for the rule again on general grounds, and was told they would think about it, and the laugh had already ended the discussion. The third turn was in August, and it was the sweepings, and it is the one where you can see the whole system working against him.
There was grain dust and sweepings accumulating on the ledges and the beams and in the corners of the basement, as there always is, and he chalked it and got some of it cleaned, and not all of it. And in August he went past Pallister to the board, which was the only thing left to do, and was also the thing that finished any chance he had. Because a night watchman who goes over the manager's head to a board of farmers has made the manager look bad in front of the men who elected him. And Pallister, who was not a bad man, was from that day a man with a grievance, and the board, who were 40 busy farmers in harvest, backed their manager, which is what boards do. He was told in that meeting, in as many words, to mind his own business and watch the building. He kept chalking. He did not stop for one night. There are dates on those walls from September and October of 1896 that were still legible when they cleared the site, and my father saw them, and he told me that was the thing that broke him, afterward, standing in the wreck and seeing a column of 8 dates on a piece of a wall that was still standing, in an old man's handwriting, next to a place where nothing had been fixed. The fourth turn is not really a turn, and I include it because it is the truest thing in this account, and it happened in the last week of September. Gideon Ryle went to the wives, not with the fire argument. He had learned by then. What he did was tell 2 or 3 women in the store, in an ordinary way, that if their husbands ever came home saying there had been smoke at the elevator, they were to ask them one question, which was whether anybody had opened the top doors. That is all he did. He planted one question in 3 households. And it did nothing whatever, because on the 19th of October, there was no time to go home and ask anybody anything. And this is where I have to stop being tidy about it. Not everything a good man does works out. He tried a thing that had worked for other people in other stories, and it did not work in his. And he died not knowing whether any of it had made any difference at all. And it had not. The 19th of October was a Monday, and it was the heaviest day of that year's receiving, and there were wagons backed up on the approach at 7 in the morning, and there were still wagons at 4 in the afternoon. The fire started at about 20 minutes to 5 in the evening, in the basement, at the boot of the south leg, in the bearing that had been chalked 11 times in December and greased in March, and was to have been replaced in the summer. Gideon Ryle was not on duty. His shift began at 6. He was at his boarding house, 400 yards away, and he came at a run when the alarm went, and he arrived about 6 minutes after the fire was found, and it was still, at that moment, a fire in a basement. 11 men were there. My father was one of them. Pallister was one of them. There was a bucket line forming from the stock tank, and 2 men with axes, and somebody had already sent a boy for the town's hand engine, which was a mile off, and which arrived at 20 past 5, and never mattered at all. And what those 11 men were doing in the first minutes, with the best will in the world, and the courage that men have in those situations, was this. They had opened the main doors on the ground floor, on both sides, to get the bucket line in and the smoke out. 2 of them had gone up the stairs and opened the head house doors at the top, 60 feet up, because there was smoke gathering in the head house, and it seemed obvious that it should be let out. And a 3rd man was working at the manhole cover on the south leg casing, at the 2nd floor, trying to get it open so they could see whether the fire had got into the leg. Every single one of those things was a reasonable act by a competent person, and together, in about 4 minutes, they built the flue. Gideon Ryle came in through the ground floor doors into the smoke and understood, I am sure, instantly and completely, what was being done and what it would produce, and he had perhaps 90 seconds in which the building could still have been saved. And he did not say anything. My father has been dead 30 years, and this was the thing he could not put down. He was standing 8 feet from Gideon Ryle. He said the old man came in and stopped and looked up at the leg casings and turned around and looked at the open doors and the daylight coming in both sides, and stood there with his hat in his hand and did not speak. Then he went and got in the bucket line.
He worked that line for an hour and a half at 58 until his hands failed him. And then he carried water to the men who were working it, and he was there at 9 at night when the head house came down into the bins, and he never said one word to any man there about doors or legs or draft. Not that night, and not in the 11 years afterward that he lived in that town. My father talked about those 4 hours perhaps a dozen times in his life, and always in the same order, and I will give it the way he gave it. The first half hour was hope. Men were working hard and well, and there was a bucket line and smoke coming out of the doors, and it seemed to everybody there that they were fighting a fire in a basement and winning, because they could not see into the leg casings, and there was nothing to see from outside. At about 5:15, the head house lit. He said the whole top of the building went at once, 60 feet above their heads, like a lamp being turned up, and that the men on the ground stopped and looked up, and that somebody said, "How did it get up there?" Nobody answered. Gideon Ryle was 30 feet away in the line and did not turn around. The second hour was the worst, my father said, because everybody understood by then that the building was lost, and nobody could say so. And so 11 men went on running buckets at a fire 80 feet above them that no bucket could reach for an hour, because stopping would have meant agreeing out loud that 90,000 bushels of their neighbor's wheat was gone. The hand engine came at 5:20 and could throw water about 40 feet, which was not half the height it needed, and they used it anyway on the ground floor all evening. At about 7, the bins began to burn from above, which is a thing my father said he hoped never to see again. Grain does not flare. 90,000 bushels of wheat on fire from the top down burns slowly and hugely, and it smells, he said, almost like baking for the first hour, which was the detail that upset him most for the rest of his life, that a disaster of that size began by smelling like bread. The whole district could see it. There were farm families standing in their own yards 9 and 10 miles off, watching the sky over Rideau Junction, and a good many of them knew that everything they had grown that year was in it. At 9, the head house came down through the bin floor, and the walls went in on it, and after that there was nothing to do but keep it from spreading to the scale house and the sheds, and they did that successfully, and my father said that was the only thing they accomplished that whole night, and that they saved a building worth perhaps $400. It burned until about 1:30 in the morning. Grain in a heap burns a long time. And Gideon Ryle stayed until it was out. He was 58. He had worked a bucket line for 90 minutes and carried water for 4 hours. His shift had technically begun at 6, and at 1:30 in the morning, on the 20th of October, he was still there, walking the edge of a heap of burning wheat with a rake, turning it so it would burn out rather than smolder for a week, which nobody had told him to do, and which was the correct thing to do, and which he knew because of course he did. My father said that was when he finally understood that the old man had been right about everything, and that it was also the moment when it became completely impossible to say so. The elevator was gone by 9. 90,000 bushels, insured for about a third. 4 men were hurt, one badly, a man named Denholm, who went through a burned floor and lost the use of a leg.
Nobody was killed, and that is the one mercy in it, and it is a mercy only because it happened at the change of shift when the building was nearly empty of men. The cooperative did not rebuild. 40 families took a loss they mostly could not take, and 11 of them sold out inside 3 years, and the line elevator that the cooperative had been formed to escape bought the site in 1898 and put up a new house on it, and the district went back to the prices it had been getting in 1890. Now, why did he not speak? I have thought about this since I was a young man, and I have had 2 answers at different times in my life, and I think now that the second one is right. The first answer, the one I had when I was 25 and angry, was cowardice. An old man beaten down by 6 years of being laughed at, who had had the exact words to save that building in his mouth and swallowed them because he could not face another laugh. The answer I have now is different, and I got it from something my father said in about 1920, near the end. He said, "Roy, there were 11 of us." If Gideon had said, "Shut the doors," we would have argued with him. That is it. That is the whole of it. In the 4 minutes that were available, a night watchman that every man there had been taught for 6 years to regard as a fussy old worrier could not have got 11 frightened men to reverse the single most obvious action any of them could think of. He would have got an argument, and the argument would have taken the 4 minutes. He knew that. He had 6 years of evidence for it, chalked up and down the walls of the building that was burning around him. What he had needed was for the rule to exist before the fire. Written on paper, agreed to in July by men sitting in an office in the daylight with no smoke in it. That is what he had asked Pallister for and been laughed at over. And by 20 minutes to 5 on the 19th of October, the opportunity to save that elevator had already been over for 3 months. There was a second thing that happened that autumn, 40 miles east, and I did not know about it until 1911, and it changes the shape of this whole account. There was an elevator at a town called Selwick on the same line, and its manager was a man named Aubrey Kell, and Aubrey Kell had a written fire rule posted on the wall of his office and in the scale house, and the first line of it was that in case of fire, no opening above the fire was to be made, and the legs and manholes were to be closed at once. He had got it from Gideon Ryle. In 1894, at a grainmen's meeting in the county seat, an old watchman had talked to him for about 20 minutes in a hallway, and Aubrey Kell had listened, for no reason that he could ever explain except that he had liked the old man, and had gone home and written the rule and posted it. The Selwick elevator had a fire in the boot of its north leg in March of 1899. They closed the building, according to the rule, in about 2 minutes, and they smothered it, and the damage was 1 leg casing and about 400 bushels, and the elevator ran another 31 years. Aubrey Kell wrote a letter to the Grain Journal about it in 1901, describing the rule and the fire, and he named Gideon Ryle in it. That letter is why the rule spread. It went into the journal, and it was reprinted, and by about 1910 there were versions of that rule posted in elevators through 4 states, and by 1920 it was ordinary, and by the time I was working in the trade in the 1920s, nobody had any idea where it had come from, and it was simply how you did things. Gideon Ryle was alive when that letter was published. He was 63 and still a night watchman in a different town by then, and I do not know whether he ever saw it. My father tried to find out years later and could not. What happened in Rideau Junction after the fire is the part I most want set down, because it is not dramatic, and it is what actually happens to a town, and I have never seen it told anywhere. Nothing happened to Gideon Ryle, that is the first thing.
He was not blamed, and he was not thanked, and he was not asked a single question by anybody at any time about why that building had burned in 4 hours. There was an inquiry of a sort. The insurance company sent a man in November, and he spent 2 days and wrote a report which the cooperative received, and which said that the fire had originated in a hot bearing in the south leg boot, and had spread rapidly through the leg casings to the head house. Spread rapidly. The same phrase, near enough, that the Illinois inquiry had used 14 years before about the Cranmer. Nobody in either place asked why. The insurance man did not interview the night watchman, because the night watchman was not on duty when the fire started and therefore had nothing to contribute. Pallister resigned as manager in December, and I want to be careful about him because he is easy to hate, and my father would not let anybody in our house hate him. He resigned because he could not stand it, and he stayed in that township and farmed for another 26 years and served on the school board, and he never spoke publicly about the elevator. And once, in about 1910, he did a thing that I think about a good deal. He hired Gideon Ryle to help him build a granary. There was no reason to. Ryle was 72 by then, and back in the district, and was not much use for building. Pallister paid him for 11 days of work that the younger man could have done in 4, and they built a granary with a vent arrangement in it that was very unusual for that country, and neither of them ever said anything to anybody about what they talked about in those 11 days.
I saw that granary in 1938. It was still standing. It had a chain of small, closable hatches down the inside of the elevating shaft that I had never seen on a farm building in my life, and I knew exactly what they were for, and I stood there for a while. The town itself did the thing that towns do, which is that within about 5 years, the fire had become a piece of weather. It was the year the elevator burned. There was no cause in it, and nobody at fault. It was simply a thing that had happened, the way a hailstorm happens. And men who had been standing in that building holding buckets told the story for the rest of their lives without ever once, in my hearing, mentioning that anyone had opened any door. I do not think they were lying. I think that after enough years, you cannot tell the difference between what you did and what happened. And the knowledge, the actual thing Gideon Ryle knew, went out of Rideau Junction entirely. It did not spread from the place where the disaster occurred. It spread from Selwick, 40 miles east, where nothing had happened, because a manager there had listened in a hallway and written a rule, and then had a small fire and wrote a letter about it. That is the part that has never stopped bothering me, and it is why I have gone to the trouble of writing all this down. The town that lost 90,000 bushels and its cooperative and 11 families learned nothing. The town that lost 400 bushels taught 4 states. Because disaster does not teach. It is too big and it hurts too much, and everyone in it is defending themselves inside their own head. And the story that a burned town tells itself will always be the story in which nothing could have been done. It takes a small event, in a place with no grief in it, for a lesson to come out clean enough that people can pick it up. Gideon Ryle died in 1907 at 69 of a stroke in a boarding house in a town called Merrill, where he was working nights at an elevator for $9 a month. The elevator he was watching when he died is still standing. It has been re-sided twice, and it has an electric motor on it now, and it has not burned in 111 years. And there is a fire rule bolted to the wall inside the scale house door in a metal frame, and the first line of it says that no opening shall be made above a fire. Nobody in Merrill knows why an old man's ghost is bolted to their wall. It is just the rule. It is what you do. My father went to the funeral. There were 6 people at it. He said that the minister, who had never met Gideon Ryle, asked the mourners beforehand whether any of them could tell him something about the deceased, and that there was a silence. And then my father said, "He knew more about fire than any man in this state, and nobody ever asked him." And the minister wrote something down and did not use it. Now, Gideon Ryle and Rideau Junction are ours. But here is what is true. Grain elevator fires were common and catastrophic, and the mechanism described here is the real one. The vertical enclosed shafts that carry the elevating legs from the basement pit to the head house act as flues, and a fire near the base is drawn upward through them with extraordinary speed, so that a building can be fully involved from bottom to top in a matter of minutes. Hot bearings in the leg boot, running in dust, are a leading historical cause of ignition. The correct response is exactly the one in this story, and it is deeply counterintuitive. Close the building, shut the leg manholes and hatches, and above all, make no opening above the fire, because every such opening increases the draft and accelerates the spread. Once fire has run the full height of a leg, a country elevator was effectively unsavable with the water pressure then available. Written fire rules of this kind did spread through the grain trade in the early 20th century and are the direct ancestors of modern practice. And the pattern in which a small, undamaging incident produces a widely adopted lesson, while a major disaster produces none, is a genuine and well-documented feature of how industries learn. This story involves a fire, injuries, and, in the past, deaths at another elevator. If that is difficult for you, please be gentle with yourself in hearing it. The people are imagined. The chimney, the 4 minutes, and the rule that had to exist before the fire are exactly as they were.